Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really looking forward to looking at an area that you spend your life in, which is understanding trends. And today in the podcast, what we want to look at in particular for small and medium-sized businesses is this idea of well-being, and from a number of different angles, but we'll kind of weave around that together and see what happens. We're joined today by Ashley Fell, the social researcher, author, TEDx speaker, and podcast host, who is the Director of Advisory at McCrindle. There is a really interesting rise in the focus and the expectations for leaders around what we think their consciousness should be, their focus and understanding of well-being. And I'm really glad that you can be here with us today, Ashley, as someone who's literally written a book on the topic and has your head wrapped around this topic really extensively. So thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Bessie. Thanks for having me.
I'm wondering, there was an interesting aspect when I was looking into some of your work where McCrindle research shows that well-being is a key priority for workers, with 83% of them saying that it's up to the employer to facilitate well-being in the workplace. If we kind of kick off the conversation there, when you do this kind of research, what do employees actually mean? So that worker, when they use the word well-being, what does that mean for people?
Yeah, it's a very big expectation, I think, that many employees and workers have. And that was kind of the preface of our work wellbeing book that we wrote. Mark McCrindle and I co-authored that piece of work a few years ago now. And I remember working on that prior to the pandemic and writing a book about work and the role of work in our lives and wellbeing. And then we actually had some delays with the publishing of that book. And at the time, I was really frustrated. And then the pandemic hit, and I was really happy that we didn't publish a book about work and well-being prior to, something like COVID that kind of threw everything into flux and change and the world of work as we know it and our well-being practices. So that was an interesting experience working on that. But yeah, back in the few years ago, we did this big study for that book and just trying to understand, we had been seeing as trends researchers the rise in conversation, discourse, information about well-being at an individual level, the expectations that employees have and workers have of the companies that they work for. And I think it can mean a range of things. And we looked at, what even is well-being, and it can be, that's a big word to define, and it can mean so many different things for different people in terms of physical health, like probably stereotypically, but now there's a huge conversation around mental health. There's a huge conversation around burnout and kind of, work, particularly in a workplace context, making sure that organizations have enough resource and staff and, people to actually get the work done. And so that certain people aren't overburdened by the amount of work they have to do. So there can be spiritual aspects to well-being. There can be social aspects as well, loneliness, social isolation. So I think there's so many different ways that you can define it. But in terms of a worker and a workplace context, what we kind of saw in the research, was that people are expecting their workplaces to, I think, just be aware of the fact that we bring our whole selves to work, and that there are things going on in our personal lives which can be in any one of those kinds of buckets. And it's not and this is the tension, I guess, that we saw and it kind of explored in this book, that it's not the employer or the leader's role to kind of manage someone's personal well-being, but they need to be, I guess, aware of the fact that we bring our whole selves to work and that lines are blurred these days. And so, that was kind of, some of those findings that I recall from that particular study and that particular kind of insight that you referenced from that particular book that we wrote.
Yeah, because it's this interesting element, isn't it, where there are so many of these different pressures. And when we get into hearing from you of some of the different trends and the changes and things you're seeing, there's a lot of the elements that are external coming in to a business owner, changes from the outside world, whether that's the regulatory environment, supply chains, customers' expectations, all of that. But this element related to our role in employing others and in creating that culture and that environment, in my mind, while it can be a bit tricky and people can write it off and kind of think, oh, what does that even mean? And what are people expecting from us? There is an empowering aspect to it, which is it is far more within our control to start to think about and pull apart these elements of what even makes a healthy culture. What are those elements that need to be at play? So have you found that in the time since you wrote that book and as you talk to and work with different organizations, have you found people feeling more in the camp of overwhelmed and put off by having to take that responsibility, or embracing the chance to kind of tap into the benefits of it?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think in the time, yeah, since the work wellbeing book and since then as a research company, we conduct so many different studies and we explore aspects of culture. And I think we explored culture in the work wellbeing book as well. But I think that word has kind of given a lot of people some language even around how to create workplaces and environments where people can thrive and be their best selves and have connection and community. And I remember when we did a big study about kind of shaping culture in a decentralized environment. So we were looking at how do leaders in a more hybrid world of work create and instill culture. And the way that we kind of did that was we created a bit of an index or a measure to assess culture. And that's kind of a bit of a technical kind of tool, but basically the 7 themes or the areas we were looking at was leadership. So do people feel like the leaders in the organization exemplify the values of the team, and what behaviors are they setting? And culture always starts at the top and flows down. Everyone consciously or subconsciously looks to the people who are in leadership roles for what is acceptable and those kinds of behaviors. The second was meaningful work. So whether people feel like the actual tasks they've been assigned and the work the organization does, is that meaningful? Do they feel like they're contributing to something? The third is the team connections and communications. So do people feel like they're connected to their colleagues? Do they have friendships? Do they have a sense of belonging or banter, or, the kind of idea that who you work alongside is really important, and that community. The fourth is the vision or the purpose of the organization. The fifth is well-being. So it's in this context, we kind of situated well-being within culture. And again, that's kind of the idea of course, in terms of whether there is enough workers, and is there an expectation that people are working back really late and answering emails, and what's kind of those expectations around someone's well-being is physical kind of activity and ergonomics and all those aspects
Yeah.
that well-being can encompass. Is
Yeah.
that is that encouraged? Is that valued in the workplace? The sixth was values and shared behaviors. And I think oftentimes people think culture is it's kind of how we do things around here. That's the colloquial often phrase I
Yeah.
hear
Yeah.
about the place. And that kind of points to that sixth point. And seventh is training and development. So do people feel like their organization values training, and do they feel like they're being developed into? And that's really important. And you can look at almost all of these in light of generations and which one, and life stage, and like which ones
Absolutely.
play out and more important. But I love this quote from Richard Branson, which I sometimes use in presentations, because I think it kind of taps in particularly to that last point about training and culture. And it says, train people well enough so they can leave, but treat them well enough so they don't want to. And I think that's a really nice kind of way of thinking about, the importance of the tasks and the training and the, I guess, capability of the team, but also the culture and how we do things around here, and people feeling a sense of belonging and participation and safety, those aspects that ultimately contribute to well-being. So it's all kind of very interlinked, and
Well, everything
there's
is
lots
though,
to it.
isn't it? And I mean,
Yes.
you would see that even more than the rest of us when you're in the data and like spotting all these connections and bunching different topics together. But I love those 7. And I totally agree with you that I think the elements of how that plays out and how someone's experience of working in your business is going to have a flow-on impact in so many ways would be really fascinating to look at across all of those things. I think it also is
Yeah.
when you talk about it in that space around those 7 elements of culture, it brings us back to this centrality of the role of the leaders and the managers and the owners of actually shaping that intentionally and not just letting it accidentally come about and not be done in a thoughtful way.
To that point, I was just going to say, I remember doing some research about this and, consultation. And I think the phrase that I had heard a lot was the idea that culture is created in every organization, whether people are intentional about it or not. And yeah, to your point earlier, just around, especially I think if we're talking about leaders of small to medium-sized businesses who might be wearing many hats and have to look at the KPIs and keeping the lights on and paying people, as well as then trying to focus on some of these other things that might traditionally be deemed like a nice to have, but not a necessity, in terms of, oh, like if I had the time, I would focus on culture and well-being, but I'm too busy, doing all these other really important things. So can definitely see there's that challenge, especially for organizations that might be a bit smaller in size, that don't have, say, people solely dedicated to certain areas that can kind of really give these things the attention that they warrant and are needed.
Yeah, I wonder too, that probably goes into some of the elements around misconceptions or different ideas we have about culture or well-being or what our teams expect. So often the excuses that we'll make in this space, if it is still a struggle or we're really conscious of cash flow or things are tight in a business, there'll be almost a dismissal of these types of conversations of like, well, we're not going to have, the fancy food, or someone coming in giving them a massage, or having those types of things which are kind of superficial or surface level and not actually fitting into some of those categories that you just ran us through. I wonder, what are the most common misconceptions you see in businesses around some of these central elements of what creates a healthy culture, what creates well-being for staff? What do you see where there's this disconnect between how we think about it and what your research shows you?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many areas, and I think you pointed to one just before, and this might be going back a couple of years, but I remember seeing it on the news and things like, oh, it was probably Gen Y at the time, which is my generation, who were the younger ones a decade ago or something, in their early 20s, just emerging in the workforce. And everyone was like, oh, these millennials, these Gen Ys, like they just want ball pits and fun, and their expectations of the workplace is they want the fruit bowls and the yoga. And I think that's probably a stereotype or a misconception about what work well-being is, that it's still important. Like, it's still important to have healthy snacks, and we're not saying that these are bad things in any way. They're great benefits for workers and employees, but I think for us it's more of that kind of deep-seated specs like training and development and meaningful work. And when you think about why people, particularly I guess in the context of like attracting and retaining great people in an organization, why people come to a workplace, and then also why they depart. And we've done a lot of research about that. And one area that we looked at last year in a big study that we did called Generations Defined was we looked at every generation in the context of employees and in the context of consumers and their behavior and how they make decisions and their attitudes. And that's what's kept me engaged in this field for almost 11 years, is just how much variety we get. And it's so interesting. It's just like, why do people behave this way? And looking at data, but overlaying like a psychology kind of lens to it and a human behavior aspect. And the communication of that is kind of the main part of my role these days. But in terms of this particular study, I was quite heavily involved in that as well, because it related to this kind of concept of work well-being and generations. And it was really interesting. We asked this question, what is most important to you when you're looking for a new job? And we had all these different things. And it was so interesting because sometimes the research provides you with really distinct differences and across the generations, and sometimes it doesn't. And that is a story in and of itself. Like, how do people differ based on their age or their life stage or what generation they fit into? But then sometimes there's no differences, and it shows that all humans value XYZ regardless of what age. But this particular one was really interesting, and it was kind of so different for every generation. So the top ones for Gen Z was that when they start a new job, they're looking for accessible and approachable leaders, learning and development opportunities, and career progression. For Generation Y, who are kind of though in those family forming years in their 30s and 40s, flexibility tops the list for them, followed by convenient location and accessible and approachable leadership. Whereas for Gen X, as we get to the older generations, they want remuneration, they want accessible and approachable leadership and convenient location. And for the baby boomers, location tops the list, followed by remuneration and accessible and approachable leadership. So there's a kind of a reordering of some of these, but the one commonality between them all is accessible and approachable leaders. So that just shows how crucial leadership is across the board. But I think in terms of just like some of the stereotypes, it does exist particularly, and we're very attuned to it with regards to the different generations, and even like, oh, young people are lazy and entitled and they're not loyal, and older people are XYZ. And, so I think where a lot of the stereotypes often exist and that we see around intergenerational teams leading, people and creating cultures of well-being where different generations can mix, because we have more generations kind of mixing in our communities and in our workplaces than ever before, with older people staying in the workplace longer. We're living later in life. You've got younger generations kind of emerging and coming through. So yeah, that's the space that we've been really attuned to in the last couple of years, just looking at the differences across the generations, the stereotypes some people hold with regards to even every generation's perspective on those different aspects of culture and well-being, like flexibility and leadership and career progression and remuneration, and how important it is. So it was a really interesting piece of research to work on and to kind of see. There was another question we asked which kind of delved into the leadership style that most people respond well to, and that was one that we didn't even segment by generation because there were no real differences. Everybody across the board wanted leaders who are approachable, who have clear communication, and who display empathy and integrity. And that was above all these other aspects. And down the bottom was like business acumen and authoritative leadership styles, which have evolved over time. So yeah, the research is always good to either confirm or deny a hypothesis or a stereotype that you might have about something, whether it's relating to generations or well-being or the workplace.
And what's helpful in that, because at first when you were talking about the different generations and like what they're looking for, it can kind of feel like, oh my gosh, if you're the employer and the business owner, how could I possibly cater to all these, different things? But
yeah,
the piece that you said was the common element, to me, actually makes perfect sense as the key to answer that question, because it's like, if you are an approachable, engaged leader that's, operating with integrity, then one of the things that I would imagine you would be doing is actually taking the time to understand and connect with, either directly, depending how big your organization is, or through encouraging managers to do so, to understand and contextualize a whole bunch of the elements of the business's strategy, the decisions you're making. And so I would imagine that, one of the answers to making it more practical and knowing what to do is that personalizing of not just making assumptions and sweeping generalizations, but kind of saying, okay, if there is a common theme and it's about that aspect of the leadership style and approachability, how do we foster that amongst not just the executive, but the managers, all levels of leadership in a business?
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, you're exactly right. And I remember like writing the recommendations at the end of this study, which is hard because you're recommending any reader from any organization or industry or size business with different tenure. And it's kind of like, oh, they've just got to be very, like, not generic, but they've got to be overarching big
Broad kind of,
statements.
yeah.
Broad, whereas when we get commissioned by organizations to run
Yes.
studies, it's very specific and we're delving into their data and their context. So we can be a lot more specific with the recommendations. But something like this, which is what we classify as our thought leadership kind of research, is a bit more like, what are these big overarching kind of takeaways for people? And I remember with this one, I deliberately tried to be a little bit paradoxical, if that's a word, in terms of
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
the first kind of step was understand what differentiates generations and appreciate difference in life stage and age. And this exact kind of example I shared earlier about just those different generations and what they're looking for when they start in a new workplace. But the second one was consider what unites generations. And it's that idea that there is aspects that all human beings want, regardless of whether you're 20 and starting out or a little bit more experienced and more tenure under your belt. And then the third was lead with empathy. But the other aspect I would kind of say, which I guess is encapsulated in those first two statements, was also the idea that people sit outside of these statistics. And it feels a little bit like wrong to say almost, and controversial, because I work in statistics and I work in generational research and I believe in it and I believe it's helpful. Also, people don't sit even in the majority all the time. And so I think if you are a business leader or an owner or a manager or a leader in any kind of capacity of people, it's getting to know your own team and maybe, using these insights, whether they're from McCrindle or any other company, around survey data and what the majority is thinking or feeling or doing, having that as helpful context, but
Mm.
it's all about getting to know your own people within your own team. And I shared just a moment ago that I've been at McCrindle for 11 years, and the average tenure of someone in a job today is almost just under 3 years. And so, I sit outside that statistic just as a case in point, so not everyone kind of fits into the stats or the majority or the generational stereotypes. And so I think, it is about getting to know your own people and their own story and their own context, and then, tailoring your leadership style or how you set the culture of your organization based on who you've got in the team at that time, and understanding what motivates them, what inspires them, what's important to them. But yeah, I can understand as well, like you said, that I have empathy because we have so much data and insight and we share it all, and everyone's like, well, that's a lot of takeaways to go and implement, and to have a tailored approach for every single generation who wants these different things. And yeah, it's definitely not our intention to overwhelm anyone with the statistics. And even with Wellbeing, the work Wellbeing book, like we wrote this whole book about the importance of, organizations and employers and leaders, like having that expectation that you started the episode with around kind of navigating that. And they're like, well, we're already doing so much, and how can we be responsible for someone's personal fitness and well-being? And that's the tension. And even I've seen it in the past where workplaces are now kind of being like looked down upon if you talk about your workplace as like a family, which is quite an interesting kind of.
There's very strong opinions on that one, aren't there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's interesting where it's like, oh, it's a toxic way of viewing work. And I think it probably comes from a good place where you're trying to go, oh, we're working together, we're friends. But I guess realistically, people aren't in a family when they're in a contractual kind of workplace. So there's some challenges. And even though it can come from a good place, there's these kind of discourses going on, especially among younger generations, where they're not really responding to that. And so it kind of is, I think, twofold. You've got the employee perspective going, oh my gosh, like, how do we navigate this? And how do we have a workplace that has strong well-being and connection and culture, but not go too far in one way that then we become viewed as toxic or whatever it might be. But then you've also got, competing demands for business owners and leaders, of course, to navigate tension of helping employees, but also deliver the outcomes. All this is to say, I empathize with business owners because it's a complex kind of business landscape, and let alone all the external mega trends going on, and inflationary environment and cost of living and all of that.
Exactly.
Let alone the kind of, well, how do we create cultures where people feel, valued and seen, and they can contribute good work, and their well-being is prioritized.
And I suppose it's that element too of, as you said, around the research. Nothing is this sure thing of like, okay, this will absolutely be what the situation's going to look like in your organization for these different groups of people. But if we can be consciously engaging with and taking on some of these ideas, it's that opportunity to go, ooh, I hadn't even thought about that, or there's a blind spot of something that we could consider. And I think it can be easy, especially in the current conditions where people, as you mentioned, are overwhelmed, feeling stretched in lots of different directions, and leaders are sort of, in many instances, just trying to keep their head above water of like, okay, how do we actually keep this business operating? But if it can shift into that space of what about this is helpful? How does this potentially help me see ways that I could be reducing some of the risk around attracting the right people, and even more importantly, keeping them here and making them want to work here, not through fear or scarcity, but because this is a great place to work. So I think some of those pieces are really a shift in our own engagement with something like this data or the trends that someone like you can point out to us.
Yeah, for sure. And I remember with the Work Wellbeing book, we did look at this because another kind of misconception or stereotype that some people might have, especially if they're more of a business oriented or data driven person, this kind of conversation can be a bit like warm and fuzzy, like, oh, that's a nice to have. That's a bit idealistic. And oh,
Mm-hmm.
that's, maybe a bit like if someone's like, oh, it's cute, like it's a bit patronizing or condescending or
Yeah.
whatever. And
Yep.
we wanted to address the critics in that, and we tried to do that through our kind of data led way. And we often can kind of ask a series of questions in a survey, which is one of the main methodologies we use. to gather data and insights. But we can ask a couple of like qualifying questions at the start. The main one is kind of the demographic. So like age, gender, location. And you can go, okay, to people in New South Wales, different to Queenslanders, or, you can kind of get that and you can overlay lots of different things in that. And one of them we asked was kind of around trying to, I guess, pinpoint and differentiate the respondents in terms of those who are highly engaged in their workplace and those who have a lower engagement, and then how they answered their questions differently. And you can kind of look at trends that way.
Interesting.
And yeah, and we did the same with kind of those who are part of organizations with strong, or they rated strong kind of values and well-being practices. They felt like, these as different aspects of culture were highly valued and
Mm.
by the leaders and the team, compared to those who didn't have that. And then we kind of compare, answers and how much more likely these people would be to leave the organization in 6 months, a year, or how disengaged they are, or whether they're exhibiting presenteeism, where they're kind of,
Yes.
at work but not
I was
really
going to bring that
present,
one
or
up because that's a major one, isn't it?
yeah,
Because we can make assumptions of like, well, we're not having these issues. And it's like, if you don't get into what's going on behind things like presenteeism and different elements of the energy and the kind of commitment that someone brings to work, you might be paying them and they might be technically there, but are they in the same category as those people that you just talked about who are more engaged because of these elements?
yeah. And for younger generations, there was that kind of quiet quitting trend that did
Mhm.
the rounds a couple of years ago, which was concerning in some ways. And I feel like at McCrindle, we're kind of generational defendants in some ways. Like we like to come in and go, okay, well, what are the stereotypes you hold? Okay, let's look at the insights and the data, and why a generation behaves a certain way and what influenced them. And that can be from technology to social events to pandemics and their views of work and life and values and all these different things. But the quiet quitting or presenteeism one was definitely, yeah, an interesting trend to watch. And yeah, I saw it like online as well, like on TikTok and other places
Yeah.
and Instagram, where it's almost like these influencers are coming out and saying, oh, why would you give anything extra? Why would you give any discretionary effort to an employer when they don't value you, when you're not paid? And there's some merit in that. It's like, well, yeah, we should stand up for our own rights. But then there's also this kind of element of there are times that you might need to go above and beyond and stay back a bit later. And if that's happening every single day, then that might be a well-being misalignment of values between you and your employer. But it's kind of that idea that it came from a good place, but it's also coming through from a generation who don't have a lot of tenure or experience, but who also bring different values, and they're much more likely to be entrepreneurs. And older generations were like, well, we stay in a company and we're loyal and we stay, for me, 11 years or whatever it might be. And a younger generations are like, no, it's about mobility and flexibility and moving around and negotiating. And so it's
Yeah.
just so interesting to investigate the differences and why that's the case. But yeah, like you said, there is, I think, and this is where it comes into that again, where it's like, it's not just a nice and fuzzy, warm, nice to have. It actually can really correlate to hard bottom line costs in terms of profit and loss. And imagine every employer who's listening knows how expensive it is to lose great workers and to have
Oh
to
my gosh.
work in the interim and retrain
Yeah, and not
staff.
just the
And
recruitment, but the training and the time period, the lag between when you hire
yeah,
them and when they're actually operating at full capacity. All of those things are
yeah.
massively risky. Yeah.
And then there's the added challenge of, I think you kind of alluded to this before. It's like you can do everything right. You can have an
Yeah.
amazing culture and have great well-being, and someone might resign. And I think in the
Mm.
past it was depends on the economic environment as well. But someone might in the past go, oh, like, why did you leave? Expecting some salacious gossip
Mm.
or something. And oftentimes it's younger generations who are saying, oh, the organization was great. I loved it. There was nothing wrong. I just needed a change, or it was time to evolve, or because they are used to this flexible working world and environment. And my, I guess, challenge maybe to listeners would be, I think it's not like it is definitely possible to attract good and great young people and retain them. It takes hard work. It takes looking at your values and workplace practices and service offerings and and that sort of thing. But it definitely is, it's possible. It's not kind of, I think, this environment where every young person is only going to stay for 2 years and leave, So it's a more mobile world of work for sure, but there is the option, I think, for people to have agency. And I hope that's what our research comes across and shares, and is hopefully like enlightening and encouraging and informative. Because I think for many organizations and just people in general, we fear change in the future,
Yeah.
and that's what the place we operate in is. We call demographers and social researchers and futurists, and we kind of try through insights and data to help paint a picture of the trends so that people feel informed and equipped rather than kind of scared and apathetic and just like, oh well, it's just going to happen, it's fully out of my control. We hope that, yeah, these insights help people to feel agency and an ability to kind of act and
Yeah.
have some influence over the trends in their organization and the culture that they're kind of creating.
I think too, I mean, one of the words that I always use with business leaders is around how do we identify the levers that we can pull? And I think some of what you're talking about are those levers. Like it's the ability to say, you gave your example of saying, you would not be the average in your age group of how long you've stayed at McCrindle, but you've been there 11 years. Now, some of that might be uniquely to do with you. I would suspect some of it is to do with the culture and the type of work and those 7 elements you read out before of you being able to feel that connection to the work you're doing and how that contributes to what the business is trying to do, the teammates you have, all of those elements. And so in my mind, when we think about it related to those practical pieces of how can we operate differently? How do we run our businesses, make decisions, and find these levers? I think you've raised some really important points around rather than judging certain generations or behaviors that we don't understand, going, there's also a reason why that level of loyalty is no longer there. And that's because young people have observed that the loyalty is not going the other way. People are not guaranteed
Yep.
just because they show up for their employer and do all those things you talked about of the extra hours when times get tough, they will still lose their job. Like the commitment and loyalty hasn't been demonstrated. And so
Yep.
you could actually say that's wisdom on the part of young people to go,
Yeah.
probably not actually worth sacrificing my own health, my
Yep.
relationships outside of work for an organization that I can't actually rely on when times get tough. So there's reasons for that.
Yep.
But I think that all of the different little pieces that you've kind of sprinkled in there are great examples of just sitting down and going, okay, what could this look like? Contextualizing it in our own businesses and then having those important conversations to not just project onto people, here's what you want because you're in this age bracket, but sort of
Yeah.
really trying to understand where people are at. So I love it. I think it's great. You mentioned when you were talking about some of the research and the two angles of like there's the elements related to trends you're seeing in your research with employees or workers, but then the elements related to customers or consumers out there. How do some of these conversations we've just had, how are they different or the same when you switch the perspective and look at what consumers, what their behavior is telling you and the trends there?
Yeah, it's fascinating, I think, because we often get asked to, I would say they're the main two kind of perspectives we get asked, whether it's kind of a work perspective, an internal employee aspect, or it's an external, how do we attract customers of
Yeah.
various generations? And there are definitely some similarities in terms of the qualities that younger generations, particularly, oftentimes it's kind of how do we attract and retain the next generation of customers and consumers, whether that's, Gen Z today or the Gen Alphas who are 14 and under, like what's the future going to look like? How do they differ to older generations? And some of the characteristics and the qualities that we see, which I think can be applicable in a workplace context and an employee landscape as well as a consumer, is that just all generations today are more digitally integrated and have expectations around technology use. And that can be an interesting kind of point of difference and a challenge of intergenerational teams, even in terms of how various generations communicate. And older generations going, why don't you just pick up the phone? And younger generations saying, don't call me without a text. There's just like funny kind of little things that happen. And we did investigate that in our latest study, even just what each generation prefers in terms of that. And it was the younger generations who prefer emails and text, and older generations going, I'd just prefer to pick up the phone and get it done. And so there's differences there, but all generations are kind of tech savvy. The other really fascinating one, I think, with regards to the world that we live in today, and then when we look at the future, is the fact that consumers and employees alike are very socially and visually engaged. And I guess it does come from social media. But particularly even just the expectations that we carry as consumers in light of how tech savvy we all are and how easy some of our consumption habits have become. Like every generation wants to interact with brands and companies that make services simple, that are one-click options and easy. And that's true from older generations who might not have grown up in the same technologically integrated world that younger people have. But and the kind of real life example I often use in presentations when I present data like this is, I think all of us can relate when you've made a decision as a consumer that you want to buy something and you just can't find the purchase button on a website. But the expectation now is that, like, if it takes more than 30 seconds or 60 seconds, if you can't find it, you're like, well, it's in the too hard basket. Like, it's that idea that all of us have these really high expectations of the brands we engage with. And I would say that's just exacerbated for younger people, even more so because they are used to kind of things being so simple and so easy and so fast. And the latest iteration of that, of course, is AI and just kind of that kind of next revolution that we're going to see to the world of work and consumers. But I remember I've co-authored a book called Generation Alpha with Mark McCrindle, who's our founder and principal. And when we were doing research for that, you know, so many parents of young kids would talk to us and tell us stories about how their kids, like their 3-year-olds and 5-year-olds, are interacting with Alexa and Siri from this really young age.
Yeah.
And just thinking about what they're going to be like as consumers and the expectations they're going to have in terms of this
Yes.
voice command and how easy things are and simple and visual. And you might have heard the TLDR kind of slang, too long didn't read, that kind of idea that we want everything to be short and sharp and snappy and visual. And the other thing I would say is, in the Generations Defined study we did last year, one of the questions that I love to explore and talk about in the presentations I deliver and the content is, we ask this question: where do you go on a daily basis to teach yourself new skills? And we tested a whole bunch of different social media platforms and more traditional places like books and websites. And we found that 1 in 2 Gen Zs, so those basically in their late teens and 20s, turn to TikTok daily to teach themselves new skills. So not just to go on and doom scroll or be entertained, but to
Wow.
actually kind of, it's like the new search engine for them. And for every other generation, it was websites. But then you started to see, even in the older generations, Instagram coming through, books for the baby boomers. But the only one that was common across all generations was YouTube. And I feel like it shows us that, again, it's heightened for younger people, but I think all generations would prefer to watch something and
Yeah.
engage visually with a story
Yeah.
rather than read a 60-page PDF or something.
Yes. And
So
feel like
yeah,
someone's answering your question, like even
yeah,
though it's not, it feels relational, right? It feels that sense of
exactly.
connection of, I asked this question, this lovely person is answering me.
Yes, exactly. The personalization. Yeah, everyone wants to be heard. And so, yeah, I think it was just interesting to me because we talk about, yeah, consumers today, you know, having this heightened expectation, or we call it expectation inflation, but it's about simplicity. It's also about, for younger generations, authenticity of the brand and their values and environmental considerations. There's a lot more that goes into that. And also just the influence of recommendations is a lot heightened among younger generations, whether that's word of mouth through friends and family, but also social media influencers. So there was some interesting ones. It was like, trust is important for every generation. There weren't huge differences. The baby boomers through to Gen Z were both, everyone was like, yeah, we want to trust the brands that we
Mm.
purchase from or engage with, their services, whatever they might be in whatever context or industry. But then you had the differences come through, even just about the power of recommendations, the fact that younger people are really looking for those reviews and those Airbnb type vibes. It's like, well, I
Mhm.
don't want to see what the company's saying about themselves. I want to see what other people are saying about the company, other customers, to get that. So yeah, it's fascinating to see where generations differ, but also where they're similar as well.
I think too, that last piece ties back really beautifully to almost answering one of your earlier questions and de-risking that element of, you could do all of this right, whatever that means, and you still might have employees who leave or go into a different opportunity. But if you come to that last element you just spoke about, when that happens, if you have created a culture where when they're asked or when you say to them, oh gosh, you're going to be so hard to replace, do you have any recommendations? Unlike if you've created a setting where they just want to get out of there and have nothing to do with you,
Yeah.
you are creating some of these self-reinforcing loops that are no different whether it's with employees or with customers, where that critical role of referrals and recommendations that mean you've already ticked a box of trust are happening because of the work you've done. And so I think seeing it like
Totally.
that and not as a waste of like, oh, I put in all this effort and now, someone's gone on to the next shiny thing is worth
Totally.
reflecting on.
Totally. And I remember writing about this in the Work Wellbeing book, almost like the power of the revolving door. Like just because someone has left doesn't mean they may not come back to work for you
I
in the
completely agree.
future.
Yeah.
And we've had that at our organization. Someone left and that was a big loss. And then something changed in their life a couple years later and they kind of came back and it was
Yeah.
delightful.
Don't burn the
And
bridge.
don't burn the bridge. But like you said as well, I think for younger people, especially, so much of their life is shared online and they would be sharing with their networks about their
Absolutely.
work and like the culture and the fun things. And I know for us, like we look at even just companies and their social media presence. And like for many, especially younger people, it's almost like they've done their research before they walk in the door for an interview. They've looked at the social media page. They're trying to see what's the personality, what's the behind the scenes, not what's the stock images on the website, which are still have a place and are important, but like what's the personality of the company? What am I buying into? What are the professional development opportunities? And I'm not saying that you have to go and hire as a small business a social media manager or whatever it might be, but even just having a bit of a presence or sharing things can do wonders as well. And your employees would be doing that, whether that's to their close friends story on Instagram or, through to their whole kind of followers. Like you said, the recommendations, even going, oh, yeah, I finished up at XYZ place, but had a great experience. You don't know who they're telling that to, and you don't know what future employee they could be speaking to on your behalf. So the word of mouth
Yeah.
is, yeah, very, very, I think, important and very valuable.
And a lot of this comes back to, and we talked about this earlier, how interconnected all of these different elements are. So it can seem overwhelming and like, oh my gosh, this is a lot of new information to take in. But when we come back to the fact that all of these elements are connected, when you take the time to really get clear as an organization, what is it that differentiates you? Who are you? How do you behave? What are your values? What's your mission? All of the pieces that are foundational. The thing that I have seen, for decades now in my work that really definitely backs up what you're saying is that those insights that we then have about our organization, instead of trying to be all things to all people, you actually then just present authentically who it is that you are and what you offer. And that won't be appealing to a whole bunch of people, won't want to work with you or won't want to buy from you. And that's okay. Like, I think we
Mm.
also need to stop trying to think, oh my goodness, unless everyone wants to work here or this is, everyone's favorite brand, we've failed. Not everyone needs you. Not everyone is going to like to work in the way you do. And that's okay. But it's having the consistency and that integrity piece in place where you're projecting out into the world an image that is actually then the experience of someone working there, because it's the disconnect that then creates a whole lot of problems.
Yes, I think that's so important and so valuable and wise to share. And it kind of, when you were speaking, it reminds me of a quote that I almost exclusively use these days to end every of the 50 presentations or so I do a year at conferences and events, which is this quote from the Work Wellbeing book, actually, which says the strength of an organization comes from its stories and its traditions, but the future of an organization rests in its relevance and innovation. And I think that for me is quite a powerful quote because at the end of a talk or a podcast interview like this, where someone's like, wow, McCrindle's got all these data and Ashley Fell just came in and shared everything about how younger people want XYZ and we have to change everything. It's like, that's not the message at all that I
No.
want anyone to leave with, especially a small business owner who's already probably working quite a lot and feels like there's already so much to do. It's like, and like you said, you've got to work out, I guess, what's non-negotiable for you. What are your values and the legacy of your brand that and your purpose that doesn't change even when the external environment does and the trends come and the economic winds of change or whatever it might be or technology. It's like those things will come and change maybe particular services or offerings or what you do, but it's that kind of you can't be everything to everyone. And so working out what you will be flexible and what you won't be flexible on, I think is quite a good thing and a tension. And it's both. It's not, it's kind of, well, this is our legacy and this is important to us as a company, but then this is what we can tweak and change to pivot and remain relevant for those changes, whether they're demographic or economic or generational from that customer perspective or that employee perspective. So I think great leaders have to navigate that tension, which is the plight of a leader and a business owner particularly. So
Totally agree, because I think it's no different if you look at the elements to do with parenting, where they always talk about actually a kid having boundaries makes them feel safer. Like that being strict in some of those elements creates more freedom and allows them to relax because they know what to expect. They know what is within the, like, okay, that's all good. Step over that line, there'll be a consequence. It's the same when we talk about creating routines and structure that actually then enable freedom and innovation and new ideas. All of the things that you've spoken about, I definitely think sit in that category. By taking the time to identify those elements as an organisation that are non-negotiable and communicating them clearly. Again, we've then set that expectation, and as long as our behaviour is consistent and follows we said it was non-negotiable, and when something got tough, we actually backed that up with our behaviour, then again, all of those elements that you ran through before start to be demonstrated to an employee or demonstrated to a customer, consumer out there in the world, where they're like, you said this was important to you. And when that difficult thing happened, I saw that reflected back to me. And even if the majority of people aren't conscious of those things, it totally affects the loyalty, whether it's brand loyalty or employees staying with us. And so I really hope that in many of these conversations, it's that starting to accept that a different way of doing business or operating both internally and externally isn't just the nice thing to do or, oh gosh, we're under all this pressure, but seeing it in the way that you've described of, there are actually benefits to this. It actually stacks up. And, we always talk about that in our work as creating a win-win business where your business doesn't win because you had to take advantage of someone else or someone else had to lose. It's like, what is the scenario here that we all win? And I think that your research can play a really important role in that. I wonder, are there any particular elements that we haven't touched on that you're currently obsessed with or, really think, oh my goodness, everyone needs to know this? What are you seeing when it comes to those trends that you want to share with us before we wrap up?
Yeah, I think one that's just come through recently for us in our intergenerational kind of teams research was just the importance of having a fun working environment. And I know we touched on that at the start, where I think people think that is a ball pit in the office or, like maybe a stereotype of these like or ping pong tables or whatever.
Yeah.
And maybe that is that. But we asked this question, what do you value in the workplace? And every generation, first of all, said trust. That was the top answer across every generation. But it was 81% of baby boomers compared to 59% of Gen Z. So still number one for Gen Z, but much higher for our older workers. And then we had a mix of flexibility and meaningful work for number kind of 2 and 3 across the generations. But then for Gen Z, fun environment comes in at number 3, and it's number 4 for Gen Y and Gen X. So again, we're not saying just because there's a high proportion of Gen Z, we're not saying it's a fun environment's not important. And we were kind of discussing this internally just around how do you create a workplace, an environment, even a brand where different people of different ages are valued. And my kind of recommendation in events is kind of watch The Intern for some wholesome inspo with Anne Hathaway and Robert De Niro, that beautiful movie
Oh, I
where they
love that
start,
movie.
it's
Yeah.
beautiful. And they start like not really understanding each other and discounting each other's life
Yeah.
experience, but
Yep.
then they have come to a place of building a relationship, and then they kind of have this beautiful reverse mentoring situation going on. And that's quite idyllic. I mean, I know it's a movie, but I think just having a working environment where every contribution is valued, and you've got younger people mentoring older people, maybe with, technology, and then older people mentoring younger people with regards to business services and customer service and all that stuff. But yeah, with the fun environment, it's one, I guess, that, people might discount. But I think so many people are looking to enjoy their life and their work, and how can we do meaningful work, but also have fun in a way that, whether that's workplace banter. I have a lot of banter with my colleagues who are younger, and they pay me out for being a millennial, and then I'll pay them out for being Gen Z. But I know that it's all in humor because I've got that relationship with them and there's that trust. And so I think just working out how you can do that is something that kind of was interesting to see that come through in the research, where fun environment is quite important for people. Number 5 for Gen Z, when it was the only generation that had this in their top 5, was what they value in the workplace is a safe space to share their ideas. So that was another kind of difference. And again, we're not saying that older people don't want that. It's just that it's not as high at the list as it is for younger people. And so even, yeah, that whole idea that we're all different and different ages and generations, but there are commonalities, and that all of us want safety and belonging and meaningful work, and to have fun with our work and our life. And even for us, one of the premises of the Work Wellbeing book is that we spend a third of our day and a third of our lives working. And so finding that workplace and that job and those tasks that are enjoyable for you is a worthwhile pursuit, where you are valued and taken advantage of, and you can give and take, with the employer and employee. So yeah, that was just, I guess, that fun environment one was one that I think people might think, oh, it's just a nice to have, but I think it is becoming more of an expectation. And whether that's through team building days or just little extra things that go a long way for making people feel valued for their contribution, beyond what they're being remunerated or whatever. And I think that fun environment kind of does lead back into the culture of an organization, and yeah, how things are done around here, and just moments of laughter. And last year, for my 10 years at McCrindle, I shared a post on LinkedIn, which was like 10 reflections from 10 years. And I just put in there like about having fun and laughing. And I'm out of the office a lot with my role and traveling interstate and sometimes overseas. But when I come back, I have a team that report to me, and as a more like senior person in the organization, who's second longest standing employee, I think it is, I really do try and create those moments of fun, and see my role as delivering important work and very public facing work, but also having a laugh. And even with presentations, I find like laughter is the secret sauce to connection with the stats and humanizing it and telling stories. And so humor's sometimes hard to get right. But I think it's worth pursuing, and it can just alleviate moments of heaviness, and, it can create connection and help people, feel valued. So there's just a couple of other random thoughts we've been looking at through the research, but also kind of in an
I
actual
love that.
workplace environment.
I also think it does a really beautiful job of taking us all the way back in that first question where I quoted some of your research around, where is it? The fact that 83% of workers were saying it was the employer's responsibility to facilitate well-being in the workplace. That example you just gave around fun could be a really practical one to use as, okay, facilitating well-being in the workplace doesn't mean you have to be the one doing it. So there's sometimes these elements of how do we think about and then signal that something is important by actually saying, you know what, if I went out and tried to have fun, I would just prove how daggy I am and out of touch, right? But maybe, you gave the example of the beautiful movie, The Intern, but maybe it's that thing of looking around and going, who naturally does that well? If I observe who are a range of different age groups responding well to, and how do I actually empower them and give a platform for them to say, this is important to us. Like we want to be intentional about it. That doesn't mean we're going to be the ones as the leaders or the CEO or the owner who's making it fun. Do you know what I mean? So I think it's actually a really lovely example to take us all the way back to facilitating some of these things is about deciding which pieces are important and then actually signaling their importance by giving time, space, budget, whatever it is, to allocate to that becoming part of what is going on in their everyday.
Yeah, I love that. And that's a way to build other leaders up, which is also the role of a leader. And leadership's, I think, evolved as well away from just the people who have the title, but to actually those who have influence. And like you said, it's like, who are the people that connect across the generations, who have the respect and the colloquial, like fun kind of term on social media is like the personality highs, the ones who like get on with everyone, and it's kind of a joke, but it's also those people that, yeah, lighten the mood and have fun. It's like, well, how can we utilize their gifts in this context and to bring other people into that space that they might just find naturally. So yeah, I think that's a really great piece of advice.
I love that. Thank you so much. Where is the best place if people want to learn more about your work, read some of the research? How do people connect with you?
We have so much available on McCrindle.com. There's millions of, maybe not millions, there's lots of infographics and reports and, videos and that sort of thing. So we try and kind of release as much of that as we can. We have a subscription kind of platform as well, but most of, at the very least, like the infographic summaries, which I feel like are a stepping stone to some of those bigger visualized reports. All of those are freely available on our website. We have very wonderful in-house team of designers who kind of help us visualize that research, because we know people are visual and social and want to look at visual stories. So we know that not everyone loves demographics as much as we do. So we try and make those really story-based and interesting. And a lot of that can be found at McCrindle.com.
Wonderful. We will share that in the show notes and pop it in the comments as well. But thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today and giving us some of those insights into the trends you're seeing and hopefully some of the things we can avoid, as well as what we can embrace in amongst all the change that's going on. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Bessie. Appreciate it.